Josh, it's been a while. We sat on a chairlift. How many years ago?
I don't know, it's like 5-6 years ago, maybe.
Is that where it starts? Right? It sounds like an appropriate place to start the story. I mean, obviously, your story running the business at Table XI. Now, just XI? Is that how you pronounce it now? Or is it?
Well, actually, post rebrand, it's now TXI.
Actually, TXI. Like I said, XI. I forgot the first letter.
Right. Technology, experience, innovation, TXI.
Obviously, your journey was going before we met, but do you want to give your interpretation of meeting me, so that way you can actually tell the truth, unless you want to hear the bullshit version that I'm going to spit off, or what?
Sure. Well, I skied onto a chairlift at the Young Entrepreneurs Council, escaped to Powder Mountain, and I always make a point when I'm at an event like that, or when I'm skiing wherever, if I'm by myself or whatever, hop a chair with someone as opposed to by yourself. And being a high E extrovert, I started up a conversation, or you being a high E extrovert started up a conversation. I don't remember who else was on the chair.
But we started talking about, right?
Yeah, right in the middle of our conversation about this, that, or the other. But, brought up that, I had this business and that I was being fairly transparent about being unsure as to what the future of it was. We had started it without sort of clarity of what we were trying to do as young entrepreneurs, and as we had become less young entrepreneurs, just became clear that it sort of needed a different definition of why it existed and where it was going and what the plan was, and so it's kind of interesting because you're in a conference like that where there's a lot of people who like purport to really have a clear idea of what they're doing, but it's often awful. And so I didn't have a clear idea, and you sort of feel bad. You're a services guy. Oh, that people look down on the services businesses. Oh, you're like, you're not aggressively growing it as big as possible as you can sell it for $1 gazillion. Like those are the tropes that sort of so dominant. And, I was clearly and willing to sort of share my discomfort and uncertainty and confusion about where we were going, even in just the beginning of this like 5-minute chairlift ride, and that we had been thinking about ESOP as a potential sort of end destination, which of course was like instant catnip for Ryan Tansen, who started asking questions about how did I come to that conclusion, and what thinking had I done, what analysis, and and so that just became the beginning of a conversation that lasted several laps of skiing and chairlifts that day, and then more conversations and eventual some work together, and then fast forward a few more years, an actual ESOP. So there you go.
And I will call it dear friendship, man. Yeah, and I'll as we jump in, I'll let you tell a little bit of your backstory of what TXI does and kind of how we got to where you are right now. But yeah, man, like when I met you and we were on that chairlift, kind of what you're talking about, Josh, like I think about like kind of the passion that I've had for what I'm doing, and honestly, like your thoughts and your questions were the type of person that I want to work with. It's like, he's actually thinking through this shit. Like, what a concept. And I was like, oh my God, like he's actually putting weight on having choices and what those mean to him. And it's just different than, like you said, like the other kind of arbitrary goals that people have. And I found that very interesting. And since the years that we know each other, I know that your brain, I've said to people, like, I think Josh's brain is actually more noisy upstairs than mine, of like all the things and all the questions of the macro world, the micro world. And I found it very enjoyable, like listening to your thinking out loud and being playing a small part into kind of the shuffling of the direction that you've gone.
Yes, my wife would tell you it's not necessarily a safe place to be within radiation distance of my neuroses. It make you sort of wonder about everything. What's real? Why are we on Earth? I found that I find myself with the young kids. We've both got young kids. Mine are 5 and 3, and the older one is showing, unfortunately, a deep number of similarities to his father. And so he'll ask questions like kid questions, and I'll be like trying to answer them as authentically as possible. One time he's asking, so why are you, I was like, Sam, you can't walk on the grass there. He's like, why? It's like, well, that's someone's lawn. It's like, well, why can I walk here? So, well, that's the sidewalk. That's public property. It's like, the lawn's private property. It's like, what are you talking about? And then I find myself trying to explain like property rights to a, like Western, like, so you own the land in an ever so smaller cone all the way to the core of the earth. Here we are, apes that have been on this planet for 10,000 years, and we think we own land. And try to explain that to a child. It's like, the more you say it, the more it sounds completely ridiculous, like the vast majority of the stuff we talk about. So it doesn't survive real scrutiny. So there you go.
But likewise, I will spare the listeners the story I had with my daughters on Friday, because they asked about something on a map, and then I went all the way down into like capitalism and stuff.
It's like, why do the names of the countries in Africa keep changing, Daddy? It's like,
sit down, son. Well, for 4 hours.
This is gonna be a while.
So that's giving people, like, in the middle of all the sarcasm and humor and all the swirling around of all that. That's pretty much the origin of the chairlift story. So let's give everybody a little bit of a backdrop, Josh. Like, where did TXI come from? How did you, kind of how did you become an entrepreneur, and like, why did that journey, like, why did you gravitate towards that, and kind of where were you guys at by the time you got to where we met?
Yeah. So the long story, slightly less long version of all this is, I was raised in a small city in Canada. My parents are both intellectuals. My dad's a musician, plays in a symphony. My mom's a psychotherapist, who's now a management psychologist, but that's another story for another day.
She's been on the show. Gail, I will put Gail's. Yeah, we'll put her link in the show notes.
Anyway, grew up in a very intellectually charged and rich household. Not a lot of business people, a lot of academics, lawyers, musicians, etc. So ideas and thoughts, really big sort of part of our upbringing, like talking about issues, went to intellectually charged schools throughout elementary school, high school, and university at Northwestern, and was just always really interested in sort of getting to a level deeper. On the flip side, I was also really interested in selling stuff. When I was 9 years old, I would bake challah bread for the Jewish Sabbath in my parents' oven and ride my 20-inch BMX bike around the neighborhood selling it to the Jewish neighbors. Eventually experienced some challenges associated with trying to scale too rapidly, and thus was the end of my first business. Learned all sorts of things.
Where was the breaking point in a bread baking business?
It turns out you can't do a quadruple batch of my grandmother's famous challah recipe in a home oven at once. You need larger vessels for stirring stuff, and it just became, my parents came down in the morning on some Sunday, and there I was, like, covered in flour and struggling, and they were just like, okay, this has been fun, but it's time to move on. From there, as I said, like, I worked, had jobs, et cetera, and so forth. My first job for an outsider was selling bikes in a bike shop, where I just started showing up at the bike shop when I was 13, loved the bikes, learned everything about the bikes, started selling bikes to customers in the store until they agreed to pay me to sell bikes for them. So I literally worked my way in there, and went off to school, not really knowing what I wanted to study, bounced around through a couple different programs, and ultimately it was a very exciting time. It was .com1. I started working in the fall of my sophomore year for a venture-backed startup called OurHouse.com, which had raised $125 million of VC to sell the Ace Hardware product catalog online, seemingly at a loss, trying to make it up on volume. We all know where this story goes, but incredible pedigreed entrepreneurs involved in that, still friends with a number of the founders and people from that business to this day. One of those guys went on to be the chief marketing officer of Facebook for a long time, like big heavy hitter types involved in this thing. Learned a lot. While I was working there, I sort of had this idea for my own startup, decided that I could do 2 of 3 things: full-time school, my startup, and working at Our House. Our House was fun, and it paid the bills in a way that most kids my age weren't able to pay the bills. My own startup seemed passionate and exciting, and I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do with school. So I said, well, let's put school on hold. And, thank my parents for being willing to sort of be accepting of the idea that I was going to leave school. We're a family that goes to school for a long time.
I was going to say, versus PhDs, like I was the first one, versus like, right? Like you're like, that was out of the norm. for sure.
Right, exactly. And so like to not finish my undergrad degree, or at least take a pause on it for that moment in time, was a big deal. But my parents really didn't miss a beat. They, I think, also just sort of knew that I was going to do what I was going to do. And so they could either be supportive and helpful, or I would do it anyway with less support and help. So,
Reference Josh covered in flour, right?
right. Yes, exactly. And so there we go to start our own startup. It turned out not to be a great idea. We raised a bit of money. We spent more and ultimately failed that. I sort of got my first experience trying to raise capital and manage investors, which is a very challenging process that I do not enjoy.
Lower 20s then?
I was 19 when I started that business.
Wow.
And then it failed by the time I was 21. Somewhere in there, I tried to take a job again, and went to go work for this investor-backed startup as sort of a general IT internal sort of software problem business consultant in a small startup. 4:00 on the first day, of my job there, a bunch of guys in suits showed up, and it turned out that they were private security and lawyers because the investors were firing the CEO, and they had everybody on the roster of who should be there. Like, wait, who are you? And I'm like, I'm new. And they're like, you don't work here. You never worked here. Get out of here.
Oh my gosh! Straight out of a movie.
Yeah. So we
you are not here.
Paid for that day. I'm sure employment laws were violated there. Anyway, we spent some time. My friend who had brought me in there, trying to organize some group of investors to buy that asset because we thought it was an interesting asset. But once again, it was like beating our head against trying to get the money. The people who had the money didn't understand the opportunity. The people who understand the opportunity didn't have the money. There was this misalignment of capital and intention and desire and skill, and we just ultimately it blew up on the launch pad. So I always say I started and failed, and I failed to start my first and second companies. And as a reaction to that, we just decided, well, what we loved doing at our house, which is where I met the original co-founder of TXI, was like this marketing analytics work, figuring out what was actually going on through the lens of data and customer pathing. This is all before Google Analytics and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And so we start.
Where was your head at, Josh? Like we're like before you, as you're starting Table XI, like from the first two kind of how did you word it? Startup to fail and fail to start, like those two, like yeah. How did that change your decision making of what you were solving for when you got to the TXI inception?
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting point. I was going to get right to, which is this my naive 21-year-old brain connected the dots between the started and failed to start as, hey, it's really hard to do stuff with other people's money. What can we do with our own money? So how do we start a company that's not capital intensive, where we can control our own destiny right from the get-go? And that was the story. We ultimately sold the first contract for $2,400 to a client that is still one of TXI's largest clients.
No way.
We did like an audit of their marketing analytics systems. We got in the door because of a guy who had been a customer for the first business, not the second one, but he had been Jim Foley. Shout out to that guy. He was a mentor and a friend who opened after we had failed spectacularly to deliver what we promised him in the first business. He's like, I'll let you actually go and see my real business. We sold an audit, and that funded like registering a domain name and setting up email and that stuff. Like almost no capital into the business at the beginning. It was just total bootstrap. My business partner was very risk averse.
Like on your third try,
I think we had all tacitly agreed that if I couldn't make it work the third time, I should probably seek more education. Contemporaneously to this, I actually had a serious girlfriend in high school and shortly after, or in college, and certainly shortly after college. And her father was a managing partner, a big, huge, powerful executive at Ernst & Young. And he was not a huge fan of my resume at that point of wearing an earring, riding a motorcycle, being a dropout of college, being an entrepreneur, and being in a relationship with his daughter. He sort of just, there was some tough love that was actually quite useful. He eventually just said, look, Josh, you're adrift here. This is between 2 and 3 before starting TXI. It's like you've started TXI, but it hasn't gone anywhere yet. This is the time to finish your degree. Otherwise, you're going to spend the rest of your life professionally answering the question of why you don't have a degree. So he actually convinced me to transfer and enroll in full-time coursework at University of Chicago, which, of course, right after classes started, Dixon came back from that audit and said, okay, you did your audit. We want to greenlight the first $100,000 of work. And I was just like, oh dear. Okay, well, I'm trying to do an economics degree at University of Chicago in 2 years. So I
supply demand. Someone has demand and they're willing to give me $100,000.
So, exactly. So it was like, thank goodness for BlackBerry operating well in a low cell environment. I'd sit in the back of class, marginally paying attention, typing emails to customers on my BlackBerry. I figured out the absolute minimum amount of work you could do to get a University of Chicago economics degree. You could pass-fail one class in your major, so I pass-failed one class in my major. I ended up doing well on paper in school, but if you actually showed what classes I took with what professors, you would know that this was a very savvy attempt to get the degree and whatnot. And it's actually a bummer because I'm super interested in all the stuff that we were studying, but entrepreneurship was more exciting. And so ultimately, when I got to the end of my degree, there was enough going on at TXI. We were a couple years in, where I was like, well, all of my friends are interviewing for investment banking analyst jobs or, going to work at Accenture or blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, there's enough here to keep going. And so at the time, University of Chicago had this.
Was it just you?
Cool
was your co-founder Matt? Was it? Because it was.
No, the co-founder is a guy named Paul Moran. Okay. Shout out to Paul. Couldn't have done it without him. He was sort of a professional generation older than me, had been my boss at ourhouse.com, a mentor. And he and I started the business initially and spent the first few years. We hired Matt, was the first employee. And then from there forward, we hired another person and my old friend from Ontario who joined us. And so there was a sort of Paul was working part-time, Matt was working part-time. I was sort of working full-time, but also going to school full-time, and Lucas was working full-time, and we were doing stuff, and it was progressing. And so I was like, well, maybe I actually can do this. The third time's a charm, because my view was if I couldn't make TXI work, it was time to go work for someone else, get some real experience, go to the school of hard, or not a different kind of the school of hard knocks. Mm-hmm. Or it's like, what do they say? Like, there's no.
It's what they always say for family business. Go work for somewhere else before you come into the family business or whatever that kind of shit is.
Yeah. So anyway, long story, sort of continuing, I ultimately applied for a backup plan. Chicago had this program for high potential undergrads to apply to go to B school, the non-binding 3-year option to return to go to one of the best B schools in the world. So I was like, well, this gives me a safety net. I'll try this entrepreneurship thing for real. I'll go all in at one more time and see what happens. And it was kind of fascinating because the business continued to grow. We continued to grow revenue every year. We maintained profitability, and we're sort of off the races. And the second time they called me, so are you matriculating this fall? I had to tell them no, and they had just been rated the best business school in the world, and it was kind of like by one of the various bullshit rankings, and it was kind of a fun moment of pride to be like, okay, we're going to remove the net now and go forward here. There's no way back. Somewhere in and around that time, my business partner and I ultimately didn't have the same vision for where to take the business or who was delivering what value, and we managed to negotiate. How did that manifest itself? Like, I don't want to get too far deep into the details of the founder drama associated with a 24-year-old or 25 or 26, however old was at the time, and the hubris of what the way I saw the world or whatever. On the flip side, like, it was clear, like, just difference of risk tolerance, difference of vision, difference of life stage. It was just sort of, and I think we actually handled it much more professionally and maturely than the majority of people do. It wasn't adolescent. We tried really hard. I remember sort of circuitous conversations about, like, you want to go this way, I want to go this way, or Matt is contributing this value, you're contributing this value, I'm contributing this value. Like, how are we going to, the capital table doesn't align with how we would structure it if we were structuring it now, and we're still early enough that we should fix this if we're going to keep going. And like most people didn't agree with our perception, but the dominant perception was the team at large. So we ultimately we were advised by a wise business lawyer to just say, look, stop spending all the energy trying to make this relationship work, flip it around, spend the energy on separating the relationship and using the work you would have spent doing this to create value in the business so you can pay the guy for his piece and move on. Because if this is happening now, don't add kids to this relationship, right? Like, you know,
good way to put it.
So it was very wise counsel, and all, again, Mark Samotny gave us great advice, and that allowed us to sort of part ways. And I hope that if Paul hears this episode, he'll recognize that, there's still no hard feelings, and I have the utmost respect for his role in our lives together, and I wouldn't have done what I did without him. On the flip side, I think we ultimately realigned the business in the way we needed to, and we were able to then sort of start. And at that point, it was a milieu of people about the same age with very similar value systems, downtown Chicago, urban foodies wanting to sort of live and work together and grow something. And, it was, your quintessential sort of tech monoculture at the time. And, there was still a lot of learning to happen, but
what were some of the services that you guys were evolving into? Like, what were the services you were doing, and how were you mirroring that up as a service business with the culture of the people? Because I think there's a very unique balance. Like when I observe professional services companies, it's like their services are supplying a need, filling a need, and then there's the people, but keeping those people integrated in the fabric together in order to deliver what you want. It's kind of it's a multi-dimensional thing that you have to hold together.
Yeah, and it's an evolving process. Like, again, I'm not a student of the research about organization design and development, but at different stages of an entity's life cycle, it's going to be very different. The tacit sort of implicit alignment you get when you're first launching services. Like, initially we were doing data analytics and telling people what to do, but not being willing to do it. And then, of course, the inevitable question of, well, can you help us implement these changes you're recommending? And I said, well, no. We're an analytics and advice company, not a implementation company. And one day, it looked like our pipeline was kind of lean, and instead of holding the line and becoming one of the earliest data science consulting companies, we probably would have had 2 orders of magnitude more success. We were well, I guess we should just help you implement this, and overnight commoditized ourselves into just another web development shop, which we were for quite some time. We always had this really business savvy, business level engagement with our customer, where we would help them figure out what to do and then do it, and provide a lot of advice, both solicited and unsolicited. You can ask some of our early clients about some of the battles we had about what to do. But long story short, we found the right clients who wanted that kind of push-pull. We were digital natives. Most of our clients were not digital natives. We were mostly in that micro generation between Gen X and the millennial generation, where you had an analog childhood and a digital adolescence and adulthood. And so we had complete fluency in both the worlds of our customers and the worlds of our technological employees.
I've never heard someone put it like that.
It allowed us to, and that's basically been my value add for much of my career, is being able to speak nerd and business fluently and be able to speak analog and digital fluently. It's a real skill set, and that caused us to cluster. So you want to talk about alignment between services and the demographic of the people, the culture. Everybody who worked the company was between 1979 and 1982 for quite a while. For birth year 1983, it was this real tight cluster of people sort of going through life together. Now, gradually over time, thank goodness, it diversified across any dimension of diversity that you want, because, as I said, it was sort of one of those tech monocultures of the early 2000s, and there's all sorts of things that I wish I'd had the sort of lens of now to sort of see what was going on. There was definitely a bro culture of some real dimension, and it wasn't intentional. It was just and so we thought we were building this
human
really
beings
rich
attracted
culture.
to other people doing things together,
right? And it was a quintessential of culture fit. When building a culture was defined by this idea of culture fit. now we talk about culture add or other sorts of like diverse perspective. We know that teams of people of wide backgrounds outperform teams of homogenous backgrounds, but we didn't know what we were doing. Especially from that org design and growth story perspective. We didn't have any investors who were asking us hard questions. We didn't have a board that was holding us accountable. We were just living together, working together. Some of us were roommates. One guy lived at the office for a while. Like it was absolutely what you'd imagine a tech services company in 2005 to be like. But over time, we gradually broadened our scope of services, and various different, very key moments, we took on some of the most challenging. So we were already dealing with this divide between like business and technology. So there's that kind of, people often talk past each other, but design and development, like designers and software developers in our industry often have a hard time aligning around a why and a direction forward and fully valuing each other's work. And so we spent the next 15, 20 years sorting through the things that make this kind of work really hard to do. Cultural issues across different functions, different cultures between designers, developers, project managers, salespeople, business leaders, figuring out all these kinds of questions around, how do we do design? Is it design thinking led? Do we do more generative design? How do we piece this together? And coming up with a methodology that's scalable, that allows people to learn on the job and develop their skill sets, build their human capital, deliver excellent value to the clients, have a good time, and in an ideal scenario, do something good for the world on top of all that. And so that's gradually been distilled into a much more clear market-facing statement around what the firm does.
Would you mind giving that to us right now? Because I think it's kind of given like a little bit of the glimpse of like what it is now. Because you guys, and that's part of when we get to kind of how you did the transaction of what you wanted to keep together from what I gather.
Right. Yeah. Well, because we've done all this work to try to get people with very different approaches to problem solving to work together to build unified teams that develop unified solutions for our clients. So now we describe the company as an product innovation consulting company. So our clients typically come to us with some sense that there is an opportunity to deliver additional value to their existing customers or to build a product for new customers. And we help them to monetize this opportunity to build a user, like to validate that users actually want a thing, to validate there's a business model around it. And to then go and actually execute it from soup to nuts. So you can imagine taking a lot of the work that like IDEO does with a little bit of the work that McKinsey does with a lot of the work that a ThoughtWorks or, a top tier engineering consulting services firm does. And you bolt them together under one roof. There's outfits at scale that are larger than us, like Kin and Carta, or, we've known them for a long time, who are big versions of us with thousands and thousands of employees across the globe. We've got 75 or so. So we're still sort of what
people would call the up to now is 75.
Yeah, somewhere in that neighborhood.
That's awesome, man.
Yeah, and it's and so again, like our clients range from huge Fortune 50 companies to concept stage startups with a lot of work in the mid market to the small cap publicly traded world where they often don't have an innovation department, or if they do, it doesn't work that well. We know that innovation from within a big firm is really hard to do for a lot of reasons, and that's been a really steady, stable growth opportunity that's redefined every 5 years by the technological change.
And you guys have a unique way of keeping all those together as part of your overall like offering that you're working with someone too. And just for the listeners, I could kind of, because, and correct me if I'm wrong at any point in time here, is like, it's the advice like you're saying. So like, there's so many shops where it's like, oh, someone says they want something, they're willing to write a check for $200,000 and they're going to build it regardless if they care if it works, regardless of whether they care whether the design is elegant and human based, regardless of whether it's good or not. And like, that's the opposite of what you guys do. But it's like the kind of overall, like, gonna validate everything all the way through and truly gonna be that partner, plus in this diverse set of team. First of all, am I on track? Kind of like how I'm.
Yeah, like I think the simplest way for the listeners to understand it is there's two parts of our business. One is figuring out what thing to build, And then the second part of our business is building the thing right.
Which a lot of people don't do either of those well, let alone both.
That are focused entirely on the build the right thing or build the thing right. If you think about like the Agile Software Manifesto and ThoughtWorks, the whole genesis was like, let's change the way people build software. That's how do we build the thing? And then IDEO changed the world, where they're like, how do we determine what the true thing that the customer wants, that's unspoken, unstated need, through research, through design thinking, etc. So that's how to build the right thing. But getting those two to work together is a really hard thing to do. And we like to think, and I think we have a lot of proof that we've managed to do it at scale for a long time.
Well, this is part of my clarifying question, Josh, because I hope I'm not projecting, because I see a little bit of my circumstances in yours. So this is a kind of a selfish question too, of like, because like I've been trying to build kind of those two components for what I'm doing, right? I want to make sure people have the right goal, and then I want to help them achieve that goal, right? Like, but if they like, I don't want to help them figure out the goal and then have them go somewhere else, but I don't want to help them if they don't know where they're going. And it's been so freaking hard, dude. Like to your point, and I feel because I feel like I've always related to your brain of how it's thinking about the macro picture and how much care you have about the things that you want to change, the impact that you want to make. How did you balance like doing what was right versus the check while you're growing, and the trade-offs of staying true to what you're trying to do, but also maintaining scale and growth? And like, it's just that balance of the fiscal responsibility with what you're trying to do and the value exchange that everybody's getting. Is the question clear?
Yeah. It makes a lot of sense. Again, there's no, the truth of like being successful in the context of a values-driven organization is you cannot be fully dogmatic about anything. So the pragmatism dominates dogma. If we don't continue to exist, then we can't do good in the future. Therefore, we need to continue to exist. However, we are not going to get fat doing stuff that we are not proud of. We are going to stay lean and eat the minimum amount of not great stuff to make sure that we're around and we have availability when we have the opportunity to do the great stuff, whether it's the exact right project scope and scale, or it's the exact right client whose super values align to what we're trying to do. And so I think it's taking a pragmatic approach, and we're still working through some challenging questions around who do we say yes to with enthusiasm, who do we say yes to with some concern, who do we say yes to, but they need to meet these specific requirements, and who do we say no to? Because we are fortunate enough that we often have more work than we're currently staffed to handle, and we're always looking for more and better work, but we become very clear on what doesn't align, and so we can, whether it has to do with the value system or the industry or the kind of project or the tech stack, we can fail stuff now much more efficiently. But like, there's no doubt that there's times we've had to just do a thing the way the customer wants. I actually used to amusingly describe this, and this long predates the modern, much more sophisticated approaches that the company's developed after I stepped down as CEO, about how to score and think about the value of work. But when a client was advising us to do something we didn't think made sense, there's an old tradition within the Jewish culture of when someone decides they want to become Jewish, they go to the rabbi and say, I want to become Jewish. And the rabbi says, no, get out of here. They come back a second time. No, seriously, Rabbi, I'm serious. No, get out of here. You don't want to do this. And only on the third time, the third ask, does the rabbi embrace the person's desire and sort of let them in to study, and then still historically a very challenging and uninclusive process. And this is a bit apocryphal. I'm not sure that this really happens in reality, but it is an old story. And so we used to say, okay, we'll tell them no forcibly twice. And if they keep saying, we want to do this, it's our money, who are we to say no at that point? I think we're more sophisticated about it now, but it is it goes back to like, and then you can go back and say to the staff, why did you agree to this project? Well, we told them to do this other thing. We told them, and it's a balancing act, because when you don't have a big pot of money, when you don't have massive margins, when you don't have recurring revenue, like sometimes you just have to do the project that fits. On the flip side, we at one point fired a client that accounted for almost 50% of our revenue.
No shit. When was that?
2015 2013, I think it was.
Wow.
But I really don't want to get into too many details around this one because it's private. But the long story short is that ultimately we had a client. It was a big client, and we did a lot of work together. We really liked each other, but they were having they were struggling to align on what to do next, and we really didn't want to keep doing it the same way. And it had sort of just become a bit of a toxic stalemate, where instead of being like, collaborative and we're marching together, we were sort of in a bit of a we're both screwed without the other one situation. And so we ultimately decided to say, look, guys, we gave them an ultimatum. You need to move forward with this new path, or we can't continue to support you.
How nerve-wracking was that decision?
It was nerve-wracking. Like, we had a good pipeline and some other work and stuff, but there was a couple of lean years that would have been much more profitable that followed that had we stuck with it. So, I don't want to over toot our horn like for doing that. Like, there's probably other clients where we should have parted ways sooner than we did, and maybe even in that situation we could have been more forceful or more thoughtful or more true to our own value system. But we have definitely put our money where our mouth is when it comes to the value system.
That brings me to Josh, a question on I'm curious how that syncs up with that timeline. Is like, you brought in other employees into the fold on the cap table over time, and just kind of curious in I'm going to preface it this what I normally see, because I feel like the answer that you're going to give is probably not what I normally see, because we didn't get into this level of detail. But it's like, usually people, it's like, I have a painful operational experience. I don't want to deal with this anymore. I want to give someone some equity, so hopefully they take away that pain, right? Like, they kind of just happens over time. I'm kind of curious, like, who were the people? What was the decision-making lens? And maybe it probably evolved over time, but it's a big deal at a services company too. And you've always said that to me since the day we met, is like, the cap table is this different thing in a services company than some other companies for the way that the organization is run. So I'm just kind of curious in your overall thoughts on kind of the situation.
Yeah, like, this is a topic in and of itself. I think that fundamentally there's sort of two kinds of people who start companies: ones who think they should have it all, and ones who want to give it all away. And neither of these are the correct answer to the allocation of early stage equity. If you keep it all, you better be prepared to pay everybody a market salary, because if you're asking them to take equity risk for no upside, that's ridiculous. On the flip side, you can also be, and I am more to the latter, of like, just give it away. Like, and those same wise lawyers who advised me to part company with my partner where we weren't working together are also among the cadre of people being like, don't give it all away, because it's very hard and expensive to get it back when you need it in the future. So early on, I started the business 50-50 with the partner. When I bought his shares out, we recapped the business. I borrowed money personally to do that, paid him off in one lump sum because he didn't want any ongoing exposure to the business going forward. Understandably, it was tens at that point. And that allowed me to sort of recap it, where the business sort of looked like from an equity perspective, a dominant shareholder with two lieutenants and then two junior lieutenants. We had 5 equity owners, and it was like 60% of the equity was mine, 15% each in the hands of the 2 lieutenants, and 5% in the junior lieutenants. And over time, things evolved somewhat from there, but we didn't give out a lot more equity in the early days. We did a couple of grants of phantom when Mark, the now CEO, joined as chief operating officer in 2011. And then the cap table stayed absolutely stable for, 8.5 years.
Quite a while, yeah.
Yeah, where we didn't do anything because we didn't know how to do it systematically. And so, like, somewhere in that period is when I started thinking about ESOP. Like, 2016 is when I stepped down in the fall as CEO. 2017, like, we announced it to the public, and and then so
let's talk about that. Let's talk about that, because I just got done off a mini series talking about finding kind of the mindset of it, hiring a president, CEO, the comp plans, all that kind of stuff. So we spent a bunch of time on it last year, and it's just a hard topic for people. And like, why don't you just walk us through kind of like how that worked for you, just on whatever comes to mind?
Well, like, when we started the business, we didn't particularly want to start a professional services business. We thought we'd start it as a services business and ultimately pivot to product. And I'll tell you, 80% of agency owners I know had that initial vision. Okay, we'll start in the services grind and then we'll pivot to product because that's obviously better. And it's like clearly,
add this to you because I know this is part of your story, I believe too, is like the guy I talked to last week that was in one of our presentations. He's like, yeah, I've got like 5% equity in like 14 companies that I did stuff for free.
Right. Or pivot to investing. Yes. The quote unquote investing. Talk about negative sample selection bias. People who are coming to you with their early stage startup looking to give you equity for services are not the best startups in America. So I was often a distracted, like, visionary from the perspective of steering this professional services firm. We didn't have ambition to be a large professional services firm. And so I always use the analogy of, like, can you imagine trying to drive fast while you're constantly looking out the window, left and right, left and right? Oh, what's over there between that green grass? Oh, look at that barn over there. Oh, there's mountains in the distance over there. And so it's like, either you have to go slow or everybody's going to get sick in your car, or both. And
so, or a crash, potentially dead, more than sick.
Or you crash, right? Exactly. And so you careen into the ditch while you're looking at the cow over there. And so I was not a drunken founder, but sort of a drunken founder. Like, I wasn't sure where we wanted to go, and that reluctance, I think, has sort of continued to manifest. Is like, I am a bit of an art of the start guy. I really like that early concept stage startup. You know, the big problem, the big idea, the initial team, the initial product, but the refinement, the lather, rinse, repeat over time, the building a team, HR policies, all those sorts of things as you scale. There's entrepreneurs and there's operators, and some people are both. Just like EOS says, there's visionaries and integrators, and some people are both. Like, I'm clearly an entrepreneur and I'm clearly a visionary. And
I think one of the statements you said to me when I met you after the, like, it was like, I remember exactly where I was, Josh. And I was like, yeah, because I was talking through, like, hey, like, what do you want? I was kind of just, challenging some of your thoughts. And you're like, dude, I'm going to scale this professional services company. I'm just going to scale the same problems. It was like, it was in some form or fashion of how you said that. Is that why you didn't want to scale to just a professional services firm, or was it not intellectually challenging for you, or what was the?
I've always described. I was always bored. Like, I started the company when I was 21, and it was 35. Like, it had dominated my life. But I think what I probably said to you was that with professional services firm, revenue scales linearly to headcount and hassles scale exponentially to headcount. So they make a lot of sense when they're small, but when they're big, you really have to think about how do you counteract that exponential people scaling problem. And the U.S. military is the best example of this. They break it down into little chunks, right? And so there are ways to build 500,000 person professional services firms. It just becomes an operating challenge and
it's like a fractal all the way down into, like,
exactly. Whether you do it with complete if you're teal and there's no hierarchy at all and everybody's self-managing or whatever, you have to break it into chunks, and it becomes an operational challenge to be able to continue. And you get very little pricing. You don't get that much pricing benefit from being larger. So there's just not that much in the way of economies to scale in a professional services firm. There's some, but there's not nearly as much as, say, like in a SaaS product or whatever. And so it just, these challenges, like the exciting stuff was really interesting, getting the culture set up, learning about the people, doing this fun stuff when we were in our 20s. But as I got into my mid 30s, I was just like, I can't sell this because it's too weird. I have too much value.
What's your definition of weird?
Well, it just like culture-driven, very opinionated and strong-willed employee stakeholders at the table talking about what we're going to do. Not that profitable, curious about all sorts of adjacent things, intermingled investment assets with operating assets, all sorts of quintessential mistakes coupled with this uniquely strong, opinionated culture. Just made it a very challenging asset to sell. And I remember very vividly having a conversation in August of 2016 with my, he's like sort of like functions as my older brother, Gary Zimmerman. And he said to me, Josh, you need to figure out how to be a capitalist in the context of your business. It doesn't come naturally to you, but you need to disconnect your time and your ownership. You need to figure out how to spend less time on the business while you maintain your ownership, because there's some possible future where you achieve the scale or get the business tuned in a way that it's actually a valuable asset. So don't sell it now. Don't keep running it full time. How do you solve for that? And the answer was secession. I had a chief operating officer in Mark Rickmeyer, who by that point in time was, for all intents and purposes, my co-CEO, but not in name. He didn't think of himself in that way, but there was starting to be issues. Like, he would tell a story about the why of something we were doing that would sound different to the employees than me. It creates confusion. And it, at a certain point, to fully flourish in his next chapter, it was time for me to get out of his way. And it took some talking him into doing it. Being the CEO is not as much fun a job as a lot of people think it would be. And I think he could see that. But, he's also an ambitious, smart, growth-oriented individual himself, and really went and jumped into it with both feet. And he's now reshaped the company. Like, we had 5 years of working as CEO, COO together, visionary integrator. And he's actually one of those guys who can do visionary and integrator. Pretty rare in the EOS world for that, but it's
the approach that you took, or the circumstances were almost inverse for what I see a lot of. A lot of egos that think that they're needed. No one else can do their job. You name the other kind of easy narrative that goes on. Is what were you like? So that was a hard conversation that your mentor, or whoever that was, their older brother, kind of quasi older brother, said. But like, what did you want? What was the carrot that was making that challenge with Mark worth it? Like, what were you marching towards?
Well, for what it's worth, like, it wasn't actually a hard conversation with my godbrother. It was an easy one. It was an incredible relief. It was like the moment when Dan Wallace first shared the idea of a visionary and integrator, and I figured out that I wasn't just bad at being a business person. I was just a visionary trying to do a visionary and an integrator. And it was incredible catharsis to be like, oh wait, there is a way forward, that I don't have to destroy what. It was like when I figured out about ESOP later on. I can have my cake and eat it too. The legacy, the thing that is special, that treats people like people, and our clients like value members of our team, and engages with the community around us and tries to do good in the world. That doesn't have to be at odds with sort of creating value. And I think at the end of the day, that was the unique proposition of where we were trying to go. This multi-stakeholder defined organization is very appealing for, especially once it reaches some scale, so there's actual money to pay people. Like, it's not a bad gig to work at TXI. Now, these days, it's a very good gig. We haven't laid anybody off.
So there wasn't a hard conversation with Mark then? How, like, what was going to be, in your mind, your new role, or the activities that you're going to spend your time on?
For me, like, I think the conversation was calling a spade. And for Mark, it was hard to sort of accept the facts for being what they were. But it wasn't me saying, hey, Mark, it's time for you to move on. It was me saying, hey, Mark, it's time for me to move on. So instead of Mark sitting there being frustrated at, why won't Josh get out of my way? He keeps, like, I'm sure I clipped his wings unintentionally from time to time when we were in CEO, COO mode. I'm sure I still do it unintentionally once in a while with exec chair and CEO. But I think getting to clarity of responsibility and accountability was essential for his job satisfaction. His job came both harder and more rewarding at the same time, both financially as well as sort of spiritually. And so that's exciting. Like, again, I don't know. It's weird. I struggle as a business person with like basic things, like, feeling like it's okay to make a lot of money, or not wanting, like, other sort of foundational things, taking credit for any of the success that I've had. I struggle with that. I have no struggle whatsoever.
Why both of those things? What are the struggles with both of those topics for you?
It goes back to sort of my incredibly hippy-dippy egalitarian roots, as well as my deep-seated anxiety about the future of humanity. Like, I think capitalism works well in certain times and constrained spaces, to allocate scarce resources to their highest marginal productivity. But I think the way capitalism is deployed right now is destroying humanity. Like, and so this philosophical context is present, and it's at odds with like feeling good about succeeding within a system, I think, is morally bankrupt. On the flip side, like you think about taking credit for the success I've had, like I was shot out of a privilege cannon. I can now say that. I know what that means. Like I am tall, white, lean, raised by two parents in a happy marriage in London, Ontario, Canada, got the best level education. I don't know if I said male, but that's clearly an issue too. Like I'm extroverted. I'm high IQ. Like there aren't very many things that could be added to the roster of things that I was born with or given to by my parents before that I was 10 years old. And so that's always actually been like what of this is actually deviation from my launch trajectory versus just me following the path that what of this did I do versus what of this is circumstantial. That's always been like a definitional insecurity for me.
Makes sense.
Stepping aside when someone else is clearly able to do the job better, is going to learn more, is going to have more fun doing it, is going to build a better future for this thing that I started. No concerns whatsoever with that. It's weird, right? Like I think a lot of people otherwise, like I talk to a lot of entrepreneurs who just want to take credit for their like Ayn Randian success. I remember when Obama got just absolutely flamed for calling out business owners and saying, you know, that successful business you made, you didn't make that. And what he was trying to say was like, it requires like property rights and public education and healthy consumers and all these sorts of things. This idea that entrepreneurs create jobs is complete cockamamie to me. Healthy consumers create jobs because that's where demand comes from, and we have a demand-led economic system, and so like it just doesn't make any sense to be this narrative that so many entrepreneurs have about their own awesomeness and their own specialness. It's hogwash. Like it's not real.
And it's interesting taking this thread and then let's think about, or I want to hear your thoughts on like how you were starting to analyze, like as Mark's now taking your position and you're now thinking about long-term more for TXI of like, how do you actually monetize this without going against what you've just described to us as kind of your core values? And maybe kind of two-part of like one, maybe walk us through like why you maybe didn't see a way out. Like what were your options that you were exploring, kind of the status quo, and then why that was at odds, and then how that kind of led you towards more of the ESOP route.
Yeah, well, I mean, you were involved in that process and sort of came to the same conclusion I had come to in a much more systematic way, which was when you looked at our financials, when you looked at our book of business, when you looked at our cultural norms around transparency, around employees having a voice in decision making, you know, and any number of other factors are, you know, more and more of our commitment to social justice, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and some of these other things that we've now been able to name and understand how to invest in them, and far from perfect, but way, way better than we were in the past. When we looked at how we would be valued conventionally by a strategic or a financial acquirer, there was always lots of unsolicited inbound interest in the business. As we made more and more noise, we got some really big flagship accounts, some celebrity type stuff as well. But when I started to think about like the process by which we were going to have to go, like we didn't do a lot of big multi-year contracted revenue. It was a lot of project, ongoing, handshakey type stuff. It was well papered, but like loosely. And so we didn't have a collections issue because we always overserved the customer. But like trying to explain that to the 28-year-old financial analyst who's working for the PE fund who wants to put like a giant discount on near future revenues because they're not contracted. I understand what you're trying to do, bud, but like you have no clue how these sorts of businesses work. It's just like the how we would be valued and then what would happen to the business afterwards. Inevitably, we would be bolted into something bigger or part of a land and expand, buy and build, whatever you want to call it, strategy in the PE world, or we would be acquired by a strategic. The only thing I ever really seriously considered was there was a couple of customers that I thought understood who we were well enough that acqui-hiring our team and dumping the clients might make some sense. But in the conventional sale to PE or sale to strategic, I could never see how I could actually get the transaction done. You know, we would start with, hey, we're going to pay you 7x EBITDA, or we're going to pay you $500,000 per employee, or we're going to pay whatever. And by the time we got to the actual end of the deal, with all the like discounts that would inevitably have applied as they diligenced and just sort of negotiated in bad faith, because I think that's what happens most of the time, and then all this subject to an earnout, yada, 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 you end up getting a lot less anyway. And you have no control to manage the narrative in the future. And again, in PE or in a strategic, they're just going to buy you and then you're going to get sold again. That's a guarantee. And so you can vet the heck out of the person who's buying you now, but who's going to buy them. To subsume this business entirely to the whims of another choice maker is a decision I am only willing to leave up to all of the employees collectively. So we've now put them in a place where that can be the case. Right? So it ultimately led us to the idea of like, we need to get out of this undemocratic, obsolete capital structure where a number of the largest equity holders were no longer working daily in the business, and move to a capital structure that actually served the needs of the business and its other stakeholders, its clients, its employees, the community. And ESOP just, it's not a perfect structure. There's some really painful pieces of it, but ultimately, the sort of tax benefits provides enough grease in the gearbox to, when you look at it net for an organization like ours, where we cared about the legacy, not of like saying, I'm so awesome I built this, but like, hey, we collectively worked hard together to make something special that operates to its own rhythm and its own value system. Let's set this up to do our best job of preserving it. Like, who the heck knows what AI is going to do to professional services, or, technological change, or the economy, or this, that, and the other. I have no idea if we built something that can last another 20 years, but I know for sure in 20 years, you wouldn't have a single bit of it visible elsewhere if we sold it to PE or to a strategic. It would just disappear.
So like, one of the things, again, that I respect an enormous amount about you is you thought through this diligently for a long time and like chewed on it, and you didn't make any knee-jerk reactions. And we don't have to go for the play-by-play, Josh, but I think there's an important chapter to note that, after my involvement with my old business, kind of like helping you think through this. And again, I don't want to overdo my part on that, because you were pretty clear, but we got like, somehow you got to the hump, gonna do an ESOP, clear on that route. You went through a process to figure out, is now the time. You kind of put a pause on it, and then you waited to go and then eventually do it. And here's kind of the wrapper I want, like, for the listeners, I think it's important, dude, is like, one of my beliefs and kind of the mantra that I'm just pounding, Josh, is like, if you build a business that's like intrinsic financial value is based on the needs of the main owners that are doing the primary work right now, you can almost pre-engineer your monetization at the dollar amount that you want, as long as your expectations of timeline and growth and everything that are kind of in line. But you put a pause, and then you went back, and then you did some things to get to where you wanted to go, which I think is super fascinating, that you didn't just say, oh, I can't do it right now, pivot, actually sacrifice the things that you had mentioned that were important to you to get the numbers. So like you stayed the course, but it wasn't a clear, easy path right when you decided that you wanted to do it. Am I summing that up?
Yeah, we stayed the course in as much as, ultimately we'd never optimized the business for a financial return. And the way the ESOP legislation works is they have to basically buy the business on a multiple of your financial performance. So they can't assign a lot of value to the things that we had spent money investing in. So we had to prove that you could use the things that we had spent money investing in, like a loyal team, like a culture, like a market presence, like a track record, and tune that a bit for financial performance. And so, we hired a key person around this time of deciding not to do the ESOP the first time, a guy named Kelly Ewer, who had been the previous chief operating officer of ThoughtWorks before it was sold to private equity. And he's a businessman, and he comes from Accenture, then to ThoughtWorks, and has, a strong accounting and finance background, understands a value-driven system and company. He came from ThoughtWorks, which is one of the most dogmatic professional services firms in the world, about certain topics. Knew the founder really well. They'd actually explored ESOP there, but it didn't work because they were too polynational to make it work. And he comes in and just more or less helps us with pricing. That's the most critical function. He's like, you're not pricing your services in a way where you're getting a fair share of the value you're creating for your clients. And if we figure out some pricing stuff here and a few other leaks that you've got in the way you're operating your financial model, this business can work a lot better. And, there's a lot of people doing all sorts of things at the same time, but I do credit Kelly for the simplicity of his assessment and then his commitment to like working towards that goal, which ultimately allowed him to help get me the place where I need to be. It was actually a really interesting thing when we first met. Like he came from ThoughtWorks, so Mark knew him, and for me stepping further and further back, it was great to have this really hardcore financial guy to pair up with Mark, who is not a really hardcore financial guy. But Kelly looked at me in the eye and said, "Listen, what do you want out of this?" And I almost started to cry. It was so disarming. I was like, nobody's ever asked me that before. I'm always asking everybody else what they want. And again, to sort of just feel like someone was going to help this thing take care of me and the needs of the other long-suffering owners who we'd had a great deal of fun, but they never really made much money on the business, was great. And so, we paused at the first process. We didn't consummate it. We decided that we needed to show the employees we were really serious about becoming employee-owned. So we opened a couple of private placements to allow people to buy in conventionally. We gave them some borrowing power from the company. We gave them a discount to the valuation. And we also allowed people who were not accredited investors to buy in, which puts the company in some risk with the SEC. But on the flip side, our view was it's worse to say no for fear than to try this and fail. So ultimately, like, that worked out well. Everybody who participated in those buy-in rounds now became a selling owner in the ESOP transaction. And so we went from 7 shareholders to 25 shareholders before, over 2 tranches of sale internal to the employees before going ESOP. And now the business is 100% owned by the ESOP trust, and everybody who works there is now a beneficial owner. And so it was an intermediate step that we decided was a good way to at least show we were serious. On the flip side, like, I got an email from one employee who happens to come from like a less privileged background than me after we consummated the ESOP transaction. And it said, "I've been eligible to do the buy-in for 2 years, and I've seriously considered it both times. I believe in this company and really want to be a part of it. But my personal financial situation doesn't allow me to make this level of financial commitment. And I really hope that this ESOP thing, and I hope and believe that this ESOP thing is going to help me start to build intergenerational wealth for my family." Like that. And that is a very real possibility. It is not a foregone conclusion. Those of us who sold the business get paid first. We're debt holders. We get paid out over time. But there is a very real possibility that this person who's been at the company for a while now, will have been there from the beginning, will continue to work there for a while, could see hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars of benefit from this in some point down the future. And so I'm struck by we did what we said we were going to do. It wasn't easy. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't entirely altruistic.
Does it have to be, though?
I don't know. It depends on which part of me you ask. But no, I don't think so. I think if we're all just altruistic, we have all sorts of different problems. There's like, you have to have a mixture of self-interest and collective interest in operating any sort of set of system. I don't have a lot of guilt about how we ultimately went down with the transaction. I will.
And I want to talk about why, because if you think about like one of your narratives that you're saying about like making a bunch of money, and like depending on how you make that money, I think is probably what I heard of, like that's where you might be at odds with it. So explain like your feeling of making money from a transaction the way that you did. Like, how do you feel about it?
Well, our banker, so we hired Menke and Associates, who did a great job of helping us sort of structure the trends and negotiate the transaction. And the banker warned me that if we didn't have bank debt and have some money that we got paid at close, it would feel like nothing changed. And I can tell you that that's very much the feeling. Like, I know I don't own the business anymore, but since I haven't even received my first interest or principal payment, like nothing has changed. Well, everything has changed. We didn't sell off any risk. We didn't get any cash. We did, so,
Let's talk about why you did that too. Why you didn't take any bank debt.
For us, it was a matter of keeping the transaction inexpensive and simple, and being like, well, why would we sell this off? We don't need the cash right now. We can clip these coupons ourselves, and it just makes the transaction much simpler. in retrospect, I think I might have, maybe we discounted that too soon. Maybe we should have shopped for financing to see what was available and to just look at it, because I do think there's some discipline that comes from that. But it's also like, do you really want to involve a bank in your transaction if you can avoid it? Like, if you could buy a house cash, why would you, or seller financing, why would you involve a mortgage lender? The long and short is, I don't think there's a right answer here, and it's going to vary wildly for different people. It does feel a little bit less real, perhaps. But no, I feel ultimately like I won't get paid out unless the business is successful going forward, right? And so my incentives are highly aligned with the employees who want to grow the thing. And what's great is for every principal dollar paid, they now have $1 of unencumbered equity value in the business. And if the business grows in value while they're amortizing down the loan, you get this potential for exponential share price growth, which will really impact people's lives. And at the same time, like, getting the proceeds of the sale out, into my name and allow me to diversify over the next, 5, 7, 9 years, it's really good for me too, and for all the rest of the selling owners. And so, I sometimes, you can, because some of these things, like the allocations of how much I got versus how much Matt got, those date back to like equity decisions we made 2 generations ago. Like, is that all really fair? I don't know. That's where I think I have more struggles than the idea of like selling the business. It is something of intrinsic value. We did take risk. We built it over a long period of time. Did I do that much more value than Matt? I don't know. We've all done well. And so, here it is,
Let's talk about that was very helpful. So like, and in that in between where you like kind of had that one half start and then you said, okay, let's take a pause. You waited a little while. I mean, you guys had some pretty significant growth there. I mean, there was some tailwinds from some of the things that happened over the few years, but what I've told this story, and I like in a concept wise, and what I've tried to always get across with some of your story, Josh, is that you guys had such a pop, but then there was like, hey, is this really going to continue? Where it's truly like an intrinsic financial value that even though you guys had a couple additional tax returns, you were just proving the story that you were doing, right? And then you got paid for the story that the whole group was going at. So like between like Kelly, kind of some new metrics that you guys were shooting for, I don't know, how did you word it? Like you guys were focused, you were still growing, but you guys were not eating as much. You guys were conscious of the lack of the bad things you were eating, however you were wording that. But like, yeah. But you guys did real significant value creation in a handful of years because of the work that you guys did.
Right. And then it was, really a function of tuning more for profitability than for revenue. The fundamentals of the business, it's actually really hard to fudge revenue in the services business. Like, either they paid you or they didn't. But the profitability can vary wildly, both in terms of the rate of profitability and like how much of the true expense of operating the business is properly loaded on the financial statements, right? Like, are there dominant owner expenses intermingled with it? Are they being tacitly undercompensated for the replacement costs for the work
market
they're doing?
Comps for all everybody,
these sorts of add backs and things that are all part of the nuance of valuation, which can be a real mess. But like, it actually turns out that like, we didn't grow the revenues that much. We grew them substantially, but like that followed a multi-decade pattern of revenue growth. Where the real change was how much of it was dropping to the bottom line. And where we went from like low for high single digit profitability rates, 6, 7, 8% EBITDA to like 18, 19, 20, more industry, like the 20-20-20 rule that a lot of people talk about for professional services is 20% revenue growth, 20% profitability, and roughly 20% employee turnover per year. If you want to learn more about that, Jay Schwan is doing a series of master classes on this that are going to be incredible, I'm sure. Only watched the first one, but you can link to that in the show notes. It's, we put ourselves back onto the sort of mainstream curve, which made us look like we were supposed to look. And then when you go through your like valuation exercise, the business triples in value or whatever, fundamentally didn't change that much, but it changed a bit.
But do you feel like you sacrificed any of the culture DNA of what you wanted to keep intact?
I think we made minor sacrifices, but we got gains that were non-monetary as well. Because at the end of the day, like, it's very easy for employees to imagine their employer as being extremely stable. But if anything has, again, we as humans don't like uncertainty. We are not capable of thinking about a range of possible outcomes. We think about things very discreetly. It's either is or it isn't. And so I think there were some employees who really appreciated the improvement in fiscal discipline because it meant that we have a lot of stark objectivists, a lot of software engineers, people like that, who actually do want to think about risk and uncertainty and whatnot. And so the idea that we were making the business more fiscally prudent was actually appealing to a certain set of employees. Other employees were like, we're really sort of sick of hearing about all this like money-making dimension. How are we going to change the world? And some of those people are still around asking those same questions, and some people have self-selected out a little bit as we became slightly more commercial in our internal messaging, slightly more focused in our external messaging around, things. But like nothing has fundamentally changed, except that I think we understand better the lens of the power structures in the business through a more modern view, and we're doing a much better job to be explicit about our decision making and radiating information. We've always been transparent, but now we've gotten to be like, any major decision will typically have some version of a Notion page in our internal knowledge management system. So when you want to go and look at like, why is this happening? Here it is. And then 2 years from now, the why of us doing this is still persisted there in data. And you can go back and look, and there's no recasting the analysis from the future lens looking backwards. It's like, we did this and we were wildly wrong, or we did this and we were totally right. But again, that sort of thing we're doing really is, I think, better than it was before. And that is a non-financial thing. That's continued investment in building the best possible culture at the same time as we've managed to tune the business to almost triple profitability. So there's a Wall Street Journal article that Kelly circulated the other day. I was just thinking about, like, it's that, new research on teams and connection and to work and commitment. Being socially connected, feeling trusted and supported by your colleagues is very valuable and important, but having a clear role and a clear goal is actually more valuable. And to the function of a team and to the commitment people feel towards work. And so we've probably like more strongly invested in the former than the latter through much of the company's existence, where it's like making sure everybody feels connected to this group of human beings. And I think, part of the professionalization of anything as it gets bigger is, goals and roles clearly defined, layer that into this connection of humanity, and you can probably have your cake and eat it too.
So as we're kind of winding down here, then this is kind of that phrase that I think, you've proven that the ESOP did that for you. And I kind of think about conscious capitalism as that way, honestly, Josh. And like, I'm curious in like why you would say the ESOP structure did it for you. Cause like when I think about this, and I say this in my presentations, that I grew up thinking it was like Milton Friedman, greed at all costs is the only way to actually be wealthy and, free at some point. And if you wanted to change the world, you'd have to be a nonprofit and broke and, martyrism. But like when I read that book, I was like, holy shit, they both connect. And like you can build something of value and be taken care of and make an impact. And I'm curious, like, because that kind of connected some things to me that were disconnected. I'm curious, like, with that kind of thought process, how did the ESOP kind of thread that needle for you, and why?
Well, to me, like, I actually think it's ESOPs and selling your business 100% to its employees is a much stronger thing to do than becoming a B Corp or engaging in conscious capitalism or running holacracy. It's literally changing the fundamental structures of capitalism. Like, what would Marx say about the idea of can a worker be exploited by the capitalist if the worker is the capitalist? Can an employee self-exploit? Well, yes, I think we've probably proven that people can self-exploit, but they're much less likely to do it to much less of an intense degree than if you have it in a third party capital owner. And I think you see this, like, how do ESOPs perform when stuff gets good, when the going is tough? In recessions,
30%.
ESOPs lay off far fewer people. And this has been shown in data over and over again about the performance of these companies, because they can accept lowered profitability for the good of the collective over some period of time. Like, there has to be profitability in the long run, but nobody is beholden to quarterly earnings reports or shareholder sentiment or activist investors or anything like that. And I don't, maybe that's good, virtuous. I don't know. I don't think so. I think a scenario where you've got, like, building for the long run, building for the people, engineering our companies, our cities, our societies for the people is the best goal to have in mind when you're doing it. And the ESOP is the one of the best available tools to do this in the US. And it's exciting to see that it started to make progress in other developed economies. I always used to joke when I was talking about ESOPs with the various people, anybody who'd listen, basically, is like, look, this is one of the few things that conservatives and progressives in America agree upon. Conservatives love it because it's privatizing the safety net. It's like making retirement the responsibility of private enterprise. And progressives love it because it's democratizing and spreading the wealth
without having to write a check. And like what I think about too, and like an additional layer to that too is like, you took the original risk. So your time and opportunity cost was originally at risk for a longer period of time before, and you were ahead of it, knowing when the dynamics were starting to become out of whack. And you're, from what I'm gathering, I'm kind of putting words in your mouth, but you were fine tuning the balance as you were growing. But like, so you're like going back to your point of like it being bipartisan, is the fact that like you're getting rewarded for your risk that you took, and then employees don't have to write a check, and then afterwards all incentives are aligned.
Right.
Like it.
Yeah. In a way that is not true after you sell to Zombocom. Like, it's, it doesn't, it's not the way it works. Like earnouts. Oh gosh, what a perversion of an incentive alignment structure. It's like, they're, the employee's incentive is to grow the value of the company now. The best way for them to grow the value of the company is to grow its enterprise value through revenue and EBITDA growth, and to generate cash flows to pay down the debt. And that's what I want too. I've got some warrant coverage. Like, I'm still a shareholder in some ways. Like and I want to get the debt out. Like it's just fantastic. This is the way, this is the best structure that I've seen to sell this kind of company. It's not for every company. It's not for, every business owner, but I think there's a lot to it. And I think there's a big opportunity over the next, 15, 20 years, as a lot of businesses are going to change hands for boomers who want to buy off some of the guilt for not having done anything about climate change, to maybe sell their businesses for a slight discount to their employees to take them going forward. Sorry,
so what are the big I was gonna say that. So what are the big topics that you're spending your time on now? Like what do you, besides managing a couple people that are probably 3 feet and a lot of energy?
Yes. The 3'8" one was particularly challenging to get back to school today after a break. So what I've been doing, I've been getting back in shape. I've moved to the interior of British Columbia, where everybody is a super athlete, and just going for a walk can be a death-defying undertaking if you're not on your toes. There's the process of getting through the ESOP transaction just closed at the end of the year last year, and then also we moved our whole financial life north of the border across through all that. So that's been tying up a lot of my time that I'm not spending being exec chair of TXI. I've sort of thought of myself as being on a bit of a sabbatical, and now I'm kind of emerging. And I've been thinking about ideas around urban mobility. I'm really obsessed with e-bikes. So I ride them, I think about them, I tinker with them, I evangelize them. People keep calling me the e-evangelist. I've been getting some skiing in, and then, also ESOPs and advocacy. Just before we talked, I was on the phone with someone, like they're looking at ESOP legislation in Canada, and it is like the crunch time to try to push through real ESOP legislation with similar tax benefits in Canada. I'm only just learning about this now, but like pretty fired up about this as an opportunity and a structure, and would love to see one of my two countries of affiliation follow the other one towards a path that I think is a better way to do business for a lot of companies, and I hope this movement will continue to grow. It's still pretty a niche thing, but so I could see myself spending some time evangelizing this. We'll see.
When you're talking to them, the U.S. just passed. They did some modifications on the 1042, kind of like that 1031, and so, but it's starting in 2024, I believe. 10% of the allocation can go towards a 1042, even for pass-throughs, so not just C Corps. So they're open up to pass-throughs, but it's just 10%. If they did 1042s where every seller could defer their taxes and put them into the stock market and keep the money in the market, I think you'd see a flood of ESOPs that you would never know what to do with. The 1042, man, through all entities, get it passed.
Right. Well, I'm not sure how hard I'm going to be working on U.S. tax policy at this point.
No, for Canada. Like what I'm saying is like when you're involved, Canada. Because like, no. The U.S. is like, this will slowly happen over years. But like if you're on the crunch time, man, 1042s for all pass-through entities.
1042s for all pass-through entities. But it's definitely like a little bit different here, and the mentalities about certain aspects are distinctly different. It's a different country. But I think it's interesting. I'm one of the few people who lives in Canada who is Canadian born, who sold the ESOP in the States, and they're thinking about doing it here. And there's a 40 million person economy. It's not small, and there's a lot of companies that might like that structure. So, we'll see. I could see spending some time on that. I don't know. I'm also just interesting projects. I am young enough that I should probably be doing more professional things at some point in my life, and so I'll probably at some point update my LinkedIn to say I'm interested in projects or something of the sort, and watch the deluge of fascinating, values aligned, highly remunerative
angel investor ready for some.
yeah, like pitch me on stuff. No, thank you.
No, thank you. Skiing. I know you're going to be doing some of that. Yeah. All right, man. As we're wrapping up here, the best place to get, I know you know what 2 questions are coming, but the best place to get in touch with you, if people do want to reach out.
Well, you can find the firm that I founded, TXIdigital.com. That's letter TXIdigital.com. And, me, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm one of the Josh Goldens out there. I'm likely findable. And if you are a highly qualified listener, you can email Ryan and ask for a direct
that was a nice deflection, man. Like, and by the way, with the link that I haven't updated for 5 years, you can go ping that too. I'm just kidding. All right, man. What's the word intentional mean for you, Josh?
Well, this one I was prepared. I listen to your episodes because I find it so amusing to just pipe my friend's voice into my podcast app from time to time. But for me, it's being mindful of what you're doing, why you're doing it, while you're in the middle of doing it. So it's being aware of the what and why. Why am I talking? Why am I investing? Why am I eating? Why am I running? What am I doing right now? I really think this intentionality concept is like deeply Eastern, and if you disappeared into the mountains of Tibet to become a monk, I wouldn't be terribly surprised.
I was the kid for those poor teachers, man. I was talking to people at the presentations I did last week. I'm like, everything you're seeing a result. I didn't make any of this up. I just wouldn't shut the hell up. And I just kept asking why. And no one's answers made any fucking sense. So I was like, I got to keep asking until it makes sense.
Okay. There you go.
All right, Josh, man, I am so honored and pleased that we finally got to have this conversation. It's been really fun to watch your journey over the years, man. You should be proud. So thanks so much for coming on, man.
Well, thank you for having me. We'll talk soon.